Flying a jet fighter plane for the U.S. Air Force is always dangerous business, even in peacetime. All sorts of things can go wrong, and dozens of times each year something does. This is a story about a top F-15 pilot and two highly regarded Air Force mechanics whose lives intersected on a runway in Germany because of a simple, honest mistake. It was a mistake that had been made before and probably should have been prevented. But in its zeal to assign blame, the Air Force ended up with two tragedies instead of one. Major Donald Gray Lowry was a highly decorated pilot, what the Air Force calls a top gun. Early on the morning of May 30th, 1995, he left his family and drove to Spangdahlem Air Base in Germany for what should have been a routine training mission. What kind of a pilot was he? Good?
Well, I'm his mom. Of course, I thought he was wonderful at everything, but you ask anybody in the Air Force, they'll tell you he was one of the top pilots.
Several hours after her son climbed in the cockpit, Lois Lowry was awakened at her home outside Boston.
The phone rang when it was still dark out, and I was asleep. And when the phone rings, and it's not a time when somebody should be calling you, you know something's wrong.
And it was. Major Lowry had crashed after struggling unsuccessfully to get his F-15 airborne. What Major Lowry didn't know was that highly trained Air Force mechanics had accidentally reversed the flight controls on his F-15. So when he accelerated down the runway at 250 miles an hour and eased back on the stick to make the plane go up, the plane did just the opposite, pushing harder and harder into the ground. Major Lowry lost control. The plane veered off the runway and burst into flames. He was killed instantly. An emergency response team was on the scene minutes later. One of its members was Technical Sergeant Turner Campbell, an Air Force mechanic. When you were out there, did it ever enter your mind that maybe you might have been involved in some way in the crash?
No, not at that point, no.
What was your reaction when you found out that it was the control rods and that it was a plane that you worked on and that they had been reversed?
Absolutely devastating. Very, very difficult to deal with.
Sergeant Thomas Mueller felt the same way. He was the highly rated Air Force mechanic who had signed off on Campbell's work. But their troubles were just beginning. After a 4-month investigation, both men were charged with dereliction of duty and negligent homicide, the first time the Air Force had ever charged mechanics with homicide in the death of a pilot. Do you feel responsible for Major Lowry's death?
To an extent, sure. I mean, I made a mistake on an aircraft. Absolutely. But yeah, I'll live with that for every day the rest of my life. And nothing will ever change that.
Did you know it was possible to reverse the flight control rods?
No. No. Did not.
Was it easy to do? Hard to do?
Extremely easy to do.
Easy to do because the mechanics couldn't really see the control rods, which are inside this wing and inside a tube which has been cut away in this picture. One control rod is green, the other is white, but there was no color coding at the connection point to indicate which one went where. According to the original Air Force specifications for the F-15, it was supposed to be impossible to switch the control rods, but the plane wasn't built that way, and the Air Force accepted the final design. David Court, an attorney who specializes in defending servicemen in military courts, was hired by Sergeants Campbell and Mueller.
My first reaction was, these guys have a problem, until I started looking at it. And then I began to realize that these people were being made the scapegoats of this whole thing.
David Court quickly discovered that Campbell and Mueller weren't the first to make the mistake. It had happened several times before, but was always caught by the pilot or the ground crew before takeoff. The Air Force knew about the problem because twice it issued high accident potential reports, HAP reports, which are supposed to be distributed worldwide. Now, these HAP reports, who gets them?
Good question. It certainly wasn't disseminated to the mechanics in the field, as far as I can tell.
Sergeants Campbell and Mueller said they never saw the HAP reports, and neither did their boss, Senior Master Sergeant Roger Edwards, who talked to us out of uniform without Air Force approval. Are you aware that this had happened a couple of times before and that the Air Force put out notices that this could happen?
No, sir. At the time of the accident, I had not heard of any other incidents and had not heard of it happening before, a cross connection being done.
Had people in your shop heard about them?
At that time, none of us had heard of the high accident potential reports that had come out on the F-15.
The Air Force also put a warning in the technical maintenance orders for the F-15. Wrong routing of flight control rods could result in loss of life and/or aircraft. And the Air Force says the mechanics would have caught the mistake if they had run a test called an operational check by moving the flaps and flight controls to make sure they had attached the rods properly. Lieutenant General David Vesely says the check was required by the manual.
Now, these were not new maintenance personnel. These were highly trained individuals. And they did not follow those procedures, and they did not perform the checks that were mandated in that technical data.
But an Air Force safety investigation into the crash concluded that the Air Force had taken no effective corrective actions to fix the problem, and that the instructions in the manual were not clearly worded and open to interpretation as to whether an operational check or ops check was required.
Would you have told them that they needed to do an ops check?
I've been asked that about the ops check, and I don't believe that I would have had them do an ops check on that aircraft.
Did most of your mechanics think that it was an honest mistake?
All of my mechanics.
Could have happened to any of the mechanics?
Yes. It could have been me up on the jet.
The mistake should have been caught by other people besides the mechanics. It should have been caught by the ground crews and by the pilot in a series of visual checks prior to takeoff. But everyone missed it. The ground crews were reprimanded, and only the mechanics faced criminal charges.
Did you feel like you were getting railroaded?
Sure, to an extent, yeah.
To what extent?
Well, to the extent when they put us up on charges with a maximum of 4 years, when we knew that many mistakes were made in this, and we were being the only ones singled out.
They may have been singled out and charged with negligent homicide because at the time, the Air Force was being severely criticized for failing to court-martial 2 pilots who had accidentally shot down 2 friendly Black Hawk helicopters over Iraq, killing 26 people. The Pentagon sent out orders to begin holding people accountable for their mistakes.
If we had highly trained technicians following the correct procedures and the checks that were associated with it, then this would not have occurred.
Certainly Sergeants Mueller and Campbell were highly trained technicians, and they were, according to everybody, very good and conscientious mechanics. They claim they didn't know about it, and their boss claims he didn't know about it.
And there's disagreement about that fact, and that would have played itself out in a trial in front of a jury had we been allowed to take the military justice system through to its conclusion. Tragically, we were not able to do that.
Tragically, because of what happened with Sergeant Thomas Mueller. Ostracized and sent to the motor pool, he became demoralized and depressed.
He was ashamed what happened to him. He was ashamed.
Peter Mueller says his son became more and more despondent as the case dragged on. And when the Air Force denied the defense access to witnesses and documents they considered crucial to their case, he began to lose hope.
Thomas suffered that 17 months, day by day, he found out this is not a fair system, this is not a fair trial, and he wrote down, I fall apart every day more and more. Yeah.
The night before the trial was to begin, the defense team was thrown into a crisis. The Air Force claimed to have a witness who would testify that Sergeant Mueller had known before the accident that the flight control rods could be switched. Turner Campbell says the defense team decided that he and Thomas Mueller should be tried separately.
And that meant going back to square one.
Correct.
Maybe another 6 months, 12 months.
Who knows how long.
What was Sergeant Mueller's reaction?
Both of our reactions. Well, we were just absolutely, totally devastated.
The next morning, when Mueller was supposed to appear in court, his wife Rosa awoke to an empty bed.
He left you a note.
Gone fishing.
Gone fishing. What did you think when you saw the note?
Said he's crazy. He's crazy. I said, how can he be doing this at this time?
An Air Force search party was organized to comb the countryside near Mueller's favorite fishing spot. Peter Mueller arrived on the scene and asked Air Force security officers if he could join the search.
And they said, no, we do not permit you to go in. You stay out. This is a military action. We don't let you go in. And I was very mad that time. And I managed to find a loudspeaker from somewhere, from some car. And I called Thomas in German language and said, Papi is here, Thomas, come out, everything is okay.
His son never heard him. By 6 o'clock at night, Thomas Mueller was still missing, and the Air Force was getting ready to call off the search. Then someone suggested they check one last place, an old hunting shack at the edge of the forest. An Air Force security policeman climbed a ladder, and when he got 2 steps from the top, he heard what sounded like a gunshot. Inside, they found Thomas Mueller with a pistol in his right hand and a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head.
And moments before he shot himself, when he was haunted there, he wrote on the window, I was not negligent. And I'm sure these were his true words. Yeah, he believed that. And I believe it too. He was not negligent.
Do you blame anyone for Sergeant Mueller's death?
That's a very difficult question. I think, I don't totally blame the Air Force, but I think the Air Force put enough pressure on him until he broke.
Soon after Thomas Mueller's suicide, the Air Force dropped the charges against Sergeant Turner Campbell and gave him a general discharge. And within months of the crash, the Air Force rewrote the technical manual and color-coded the connection points for the flight control rods.
Well, this certainly has been a tragedy. It resulted in the loss of 2 fine young men who were an important part of our Air Force family.
The Air Force has done an awful lot to change what killed Major Lowry in the hopes, and I believe correctly, that it won't happen again.
Isn't that an acknowledgement that there was a problem before?
I believe so. I can't see how you can look at it any other way.
Even Lois Lowry, the mother of the dead pilot, thinks the Air Force was overzealous in the way it went after Campbell and Mueller.
You think the Air Force should have prosecuted him for negligent homicide?
No.
I mean, at some level, the mechanics did make a mistake.
Sure.
They screwed up.
They screwed up. They made a mistake. We've all made mistakes. They, however, were in a job where there is no margin for error. And yet, the mistake was there to be made. It was all.
Her one regret is that she didn't talk to Sergeant Mueller before he took his own life. He left a letter for her.
I just want to read a little bit of it. Please believe me that the mistake we made was just that, a mistake and not negligence. Had I been given the chance to trade my life for that of your son, I would have done so. It should have been me that day.
It should have been no one that day. Nobody should have died that day at all.